Chapter 12. The Story of Iron John as the Interior Warrior. So, White Buffalo, what happens next in your story after you met Iron John? After your hair turned gold? After you went on the journey of ashes working in the kitchen? And after you began working in the garden where you met the golden woman?
The next step in the story is when we enter into warriorhood. Warriorhood follows the garden, and so we must begin with the warriors within. As it stands today, the warriors inside men have become weak in recent years, and their weakness contributes to a lack of boundaries, a condition which we earlier spoke about as naivety. Mythologically speaking, warriors lift their swords to defend the king, and the king in a child stands up for the child's mood. These inner warriors I speak of do not cross the boundary aggressively, they exist to defend the boundary. Every child, or young man or woman, lives deep inside his or her own psychic house, or soul castle, and they each deserve the right of sovereignty inside that house. If someone ignores the child's sovereignty, be it a parent or a bully, the child may not only feel anger, but shame. The individual concludes that if they have no sovereignty, they must be worthless. Shame is the name we give to the sense that we are unworthy and inadequate as human beings. It is no wonder that such a child, whether a teenager or a young man, looks for singles rooms, maternal women, gurus, systems, and withdrawals. Often this child's psychic room is wide open, as if there's no doorknob inside the door. The door moves freely, we could say, because the doorknob is on the outside. If the young man's warrior is dead, it will keep the boy from growing up. Many men do not have enough awakened or living warriors inside to defend their soul houses, and most people, men or women, do not know what genuine outward or inward warriors look like or feel like. Now when we think of the outer or disciplined warrior, as it is thought that within every man there is 1/3 of the brain that is a warrior brain, or a sort of hardwired survival mode. So whether we like it or not, we have warriors in our thoughts. That is a sobering idea. The warrior's area of expertise and experience is the battlefield, and the war that takes place can be a physical war, a psychological war, or a spiritual war. Inside of us, there is a ritual space, armies, tribes, divinities, even ideas arrange themselves in adversarial fashion. It has been thought that the quality of a true warrior is that he is in service to a purpose greater than himself, that is, a transcendent cause. A true warrior will be in service to a true king, and if the king is corrupt, greedy, or in it for power, then he is no longer a warrior, but a soldier. When a warrior is in service to a true king, to a transcendent cause, he does well, and his body becomes a hard-working servant, which he requires to endure cold, heat, pain, wounds, scarring, hunger, lack of sleep, and hardship of all kinds. The body usually responds well. The person in touch with warrior energy can work for long hours, ignore fatigue, do what is necessary, finish a PhD, endure obnoxious department heads, write, as T.S. Eliot did, under a single dangling light bulb for years, clean up shit and filth endlessly, like St. Francis, care for the dying and distressed, like Mother Teresa, endure contempt, disdain, and exile. How can any complicated culture live without strong warrior energy? Often the strategy of the warrior is cunning, worldliness, and intelligence. And so there is another warrior, the eternal or sacred warrior. While the physical warrior loves the battlefield, the holy warrior loves the field of good and evil, where the forces of darkness battle within the forces of light. Ancient literature, such as the Ramayana, depict the invisible battles we fight, whereas Christian texts call all chaotic forces Satan, and so the holy battle is seen as Christ versus Satan. The author of Job implies that inside Yahweh there is a dark side. When Yahweh wipes out Job's health and family, Job gets a glimpse of the monstrous and fearful side of God. The eternal battle then can be a war between God and his enemy, or a war between two halves of God. As human beings, we feel these wars inside ourselves. The sacred warrior has a blessed side and a poisoned side. It is no surprise, then, that earthly warriors have a sacred and a twisted side also. One man is a self-sacrificing warrior fighting for a cause beyond himself, and another man is a madman raping, pillaging, and killing mindlessly. The holy warrior invades us from eternal space as hurricane energy and a whirlwind force. The warrior power, nourished on electric or magnetic energy, moves behind the veil of flesh and alters moods and impulses, shines through the screen of skin and bones, and makes the body do what the power wants. Now in our current age, certain types of the warriors have been disintegrated into the soldier when mechanized warfare came about, and it all moved swiftly. Now our story goes back to the time when the warrior was very much honored,
said the white buffalo. So does that mean there was a battle?
Not long after I had been in the garden and met the golden princess, the country was swept up in war. The king gathered his forces and was not positive he could succeed against the enemy, who was powerful and retained a large army. As I was the gardener's friend, I said,
I am quite grown now, so I will go to war if you just give me a horse.
The other men laughed and declared, When we've gone, you will go look in the stable, and we'll certainly leave a horse for you. When they were all gone, I went into the barn, where they left a single horse. It was lame in one leg, and walked hippity-hoppity. So I climbed on it, and rode to the dark forest I'd come from. And who do you think I was going to see?
Asked the white buffalo. Iron John?
That's right. And if you remember, he gave me a secret call when I needed help, and so I yelled out,
Iron John! Iron John! Iron John!
So loud that it echoed through the trees. In a moment, the wild man arrived and said, What is it that you want?
I want a strong war horse, because I intend to go to the war.
You will receive that, and more than you have asked for, said Iron John. The wild man turned back into the woods, and not long after, a stable boy came out of the trees, leading a war horse that blew fierce air through its nostrils and was not easy to hold. Running along after the war horse came a large band of warriors, entirely clothed in iron, with their swords shining in the sun. I turned the three-legged nag over to the stable boy, mounted the new war horse, received a sword, and rode out at the head of the soldiers. By the time I neared the battlefield, a large part of the king's men had already been killed, and not much more was needed to bring them to total defeat. The Iron Band and I sprinted there with our horses at full speed. We galloped on the enemy like a hurricane and struck down every one that opposed them. The enemy turned to flee, but I kept after and pursued them to the last man. Then, instead of returning to the king, I took the band of iron warriors a roundabout way back to the forest and called to Iron John. What do you want? Asked the wild man.
You can take your horse and your men back, and give me the three-legged nag,
I told him as a young man. So it all happened as I requested, and then I rode the hippity-hoppity back home. When the king returned to his castle, his daughter went to him and congratulated him on the victory. It wasn't me who managed that victory, said the king, but a strange knight with a warrior band who arrived to help. The daughter asked who the strange knight was, but the king didn't know, and added, He galloped off in pursuit of the enemy, and that's the last I saw of him. The king's daughter went to the gardener and inquired about the young man, and he laughed and said, He has just now arrived home on his three-legged nag. The farmers helped make fun of him, shouting, Guess who's here? Moopy Goop. Then they said, Have you been under a lilac bush? How was it? And so as a young man, I told them.
I fought very well. If I hadn't been there, who knows what could have happened?
They all fell over themselves laughing. So if we think of this situation in the kingdom, we see there is an invasion. And if the characters in a fairy story all make up one psyche, which is ours, we have to conclude that our psyche has been invaded. Observers have noticed for centuries that when the effort for change heats up in the psyche, the heat itself attracts demons, or sleeping complexes, or bitter enemies of the spirit. People who have joined various meditation groups may tell you for hours about this phenomenon. They begin to meditate, and everything goes okay to start. Then suddenly, the landlady kicks them out of their apartment. A filling falls out of their tooth. The laundry loses their clothes. Someone breaks into their car, and so on. Those stories point to a renewed or intensified invasion. But who is invaded? The invasion is more than a distraction or an annoyance. As the story says, the king is losing the battle. Apparently the center of the psyche cannot protect its own territory. An enemy is activated, and the soul is no longer partnered, supported, or harmonious. Remember the battlefield where the eternal warrior fights. We might assume that the enemy invading the soul is evil itself, but it doesn't feel that way. The invader might be chaos, but the enemy feels as if it were part of our own soul. If the king is actually losing the battle, it is time for the warrior in us to learn how to fight. We notice that the warrior pursues the battle to the end, with no halfway measure in mind, no pulling back. We can regard the battle scene as my initiation into the internal warrior. The situation showed me that it is right for me to be in contact with the enemy. Being passive or hiring an army to fight your enemy won't do it. And I like very much that the enemy in this story is not named,
said the white buffalo. But what about the horses?
A remarkable detail that leaps up out of the scene and demands some interpretation is the three-legged horse that the young man finds in the stable. This three-legged horse doesn't feel like good news when we see it standing there, and it obviously feels worse when we ride it. We might look at what a horse could be in such a story as this, and what the difference might be between 3 and 4 legs. 4 is complete, and it stands for the 4-gated city, the 4 directions, the 4 seasons, the 4 horses of the sun carriage, and the 4 strings of the cistern. As the old rhyme goes, 1 for sorrow, 2 for mirth, 3 for wedding, 4 for birth. 3, on the other hand, falls a little short. As for the 4-legged horse, it's associated with range over heaven and earth, and so in the Tibetan tradition, we would call this horse Lungta. In our story, this horse, when contrasted with its rider, reminds men and women of the animal side of human beings and our body. The rider stands for the intelligence or intellect or mind, and the horse stands for the animal desires and instincts and energies that have their home there. When it comes to the 3-legged horse, its 4th leg could be thought of as shame. The story suggests that we must bring it to the wild man. Then Iron John, by lending us the horse, does not do away with our early shaming. That part cannot be done away with. But we can work to prevent further shaming, and we can learn what connection we still have to that 4-legged horse. That is what Iron John means when he says, "I will give you what you ask, and more." When it comes to the sword, the Tibetans refer to such a sharp interior sword as the Vajra sword, and without it, they say, no spiritual life is possible, and no adult life. We need a sword to cut away our victimhood, depression, resentment, low self-esteem, passivity, rage, and our self-pity. Also, we notice that the soldiers in our story, when they arrive alongside Iron John's horse, are clothed in iron. Iron is believed to be related to blood, because the red hiding inside the iron, and it could be related to intellect and with spiritual warfare. We should also reflect on how the battle appears after he is in the garden. In the garden, a person chooses that one most important, precious thing, and it becomes a serious act. They may suffer for it, and this suffering means to accept the difficult tasks for the sake of the precious thing, but also the painful awareness of the other roads not taken. The passion in our nature urges a human to choose the one precious thing, and urges us to pay for it through poverty, conflict, deprivation, labor, and the endurance of anger even. It is the warrior that enables the human being to decide to become a musician, or a poet, or an alchemist, or a hermit, or a painter. If it is the lover in a man or woman who loves one precious thing, then it is the warrior who agrees to endure the suffering that the choice entails. If and when we choose the one precious thing, the object of our life's purpose, then according to the alchemists, the inner king in us that has been asleep for so many years wakes up. When the battle in our story is over, we're less naive in one way, and now I knew what a sword was. And lastly, the process of reviving the inner warrior goes on for years and is associated with a change from copper to iron. Each of us needs to imagine how to bring the interior warriors back to life, and it is not physical work so much as imaginative work. And just as it stated earlier that the doorknob to our psyche was outside, the task is to move the doorknob to the inside of the door, and here we honor the power of the inner warriors, which are likely to warn us when something is rattling it. So for instance, if I were to tell this to many others, there would be someone who would say, "Well, I liked the story, except for this one thing. Would you like to know what the issue was?" they may say. And so my inner warrior would respond, "I don't think I'll be shamed by you today." Now there's no need to hit the person with a stick, but you can keep a boundary. The process is a way of preventing oneself from being a copper bridge which conducts, and to become conscious of the conduction that is happening. Conduction is unconscious, and naming it helps move it to communication. And so we may say, "I don't think I'll be a conductor for you any longer." Warriorship inside then amounts to a soul's alertness that helps protect a human from being turned into a copper wire, and protects us from shamers, unconscious swordsmen, hostile people, and greedy interior beings. If a person never lifts their inner sword of discrimination, he or she may get higher marks for gentleness, but could end up as a slave,
said the white buffalo.